Hi everyone, welcome to Rescuing Watches. Today we have a very interesting watch to repair, and for the first time on the channel, it's not made in Switzerland, it's a Japanese one. This is a Citizen Homer date from 1962, and I just had a quick look at it, but I think we might have something special here. The crystal is very aged and cracked at the bottom, but we can see quite an unusual dial underneath with massive lume plots. I've never seen something like this before, so I'm quite excited to have a proper look at it and see if we can get it running again. The bad news is that the stem came detached, so we will need to check that, but even worse, the upper right lug is bent inwards. That's not something I'm used to see, and to be honest, I'm not even sure if we can fix this yet. The watch seems well worn. You can tell by the scratches and the small marks in the case, this watch was definitely loved, but there is still a light engraving that can be read on the back. Well, let's get started. Citizen is a Japanese brand with quite some history behind, founded in the 1930s, and the Homer is one of their best known series, being produced during decades from the 1960s. Modest movements meant for the everyday user, but very reliable. This is a caliber 0200, which was made in 17, 19 and 21 joules, and it doesn't look too bad. At least we can't see signs of water damage in the movement, which is always a good sign. And speaking about water, you might be thinking, what does Parawater stand for? And this is where things get interesting. The term Parawater was introduced in 1959, and it is what Citizen used for what we know today as waterproof. The early Parawater models represent a huge breakthrough in Japanese watchmaking because they were the first water-resistant watches ever made in Japan. Now picture this, we are in 1963, and Japan's Maritime Defense Force and the University of Tokyo are about to start a research mission to study the ocean currents around Japan's coast. Citizen hears about this and sees it as the perfect opportunity to show off their newly developed waterproof technology and decides to join the expedition. So what they did is designing special buoys that were able to hold the watch under the water level and had a message enclosed at the top. They made hundreds of these bright yellow buoys and dropped them in the middle of the ocean across several expeditions to combine scientific research and product testing. This one took place in 1964 around Japan's coast, but as you can see, the red dots show the dropping points of these buoys and they're all over the place. The message inside was asking the finders to contact Citizen to report about the position of the buoys so that the currents could be studied, and also the conditions of the watch to prove the water resistance. And of course, if you found one of these, you were allowed to keep the watch. Now this one in particular doesn't want to run. The stem went in, so that's a good sign, but the mainspring seems fully wound and the balance doesn't. Well, you can see the balance turns a bit, it wants to run, but then it stops after a while. Okay, well, can't say it's a surprise, so let's take it apart and see what's happening. First thing, the stem shouldn't just come out like that, so something is wrong with the keyless works. The term Parawater was unfortunately changed in the early 70s to the universal waterproof term, as they started to export more watches outside of Japan. So it's nice that we get to work in one of these early models. One of the movement screws seemed to be stuck, so I will leave it on for now, but we should still be able to take out the movement ring. And this is the thickest one I've ever seen. I didn't see any rubber gaskets in here, which is a bit strange, but that ring is part of the mechanism to prevent water from entering the watch. Or one of the mechanisms, I should say. Citizen came up with a bunch of different case designs to achieve that. Oh wow, have a look at this dial. I was not expecting to see a glossy finish and it looks insane. Huge lume markers surrounded by a plated metal layer, and the contrast with the black is very, very impressive. I can't help myself, so let's have a quick look under the microscope. You can see the text here. This is printed on the dial with pad printing, I guess, and the lume we're seeing is most likely tritium, judging by the age of the watch. Tritium is one of the components they used on dial and hand surfaces so that they glow in the dark. It was used during the 1960s until the 90s. It is radioactive, but its half-life is a bit more than 12 years, which means that we should be fine with a 60-year-old watch. And check this out, at the bottom of the 6-hour marker, written Japan for once. We carefully use these levers to remove the hands. We use a plastic layer so that we don't damage the dial, and for the same reason, I have these tweezers with a plastic tip that I use to pick the hands up. Now they go in a membrane box that holds them suspended in between two plastic layers. Great, now we have two small screws at each side of the movement. These are holding the dial and we need to unscrew them first. It's not necessary to remove them completely, but just unscrewing them a bit to release the pressure. Now we can go underneath with our plastic stick and take it off. This is another specialized box. This one holds the dial suspended and fixed in the center. And this is what's directly underneath the dial. We have the washer and the hour wheel below. As you can see, this movement has a calendar function, that is the big white wheel, and of course that's turning once every 24 hours. We flip the movement now because I like to start from the other side to remove the balance wheel first, which is the bigger wheel with a spring attached to it. This is what's constantly turning back and forth and hitting the pallet fork. The issue is that the spring is very delicate, so it's always one of the first parts to go out just for safekeeping. This movement has not only one set of shock protecting jewels, but there is also a pair for the escape wheel right here. Let's remove now the winding mechanism, so the ratchet wheel and... oh, this one unscrews to the right, which I've never seen before. This is usually the case for the crown wheel screw, which is this one, because the wheel itself turns that direction and it could loosen the screw otherwise. This is the first time I'm working on this movement, so I will have to be extra careful. We also have this inner ring, which is part of the crown wheel. And now the ratchet wheel seems to be a bit stuck, so let's use the plastic sticks and try pushing it from underneath. Oh, that sound was the mainspring uncoiling. I should have checked this first, but I'm seeing something unusual here. Do you see these marks under the wheel? This is not something we want to see, and I'm guessing that it was sitting tilted maybe? And either the bridge or the second wheel sitting underneath was rubbing against it. Now carefully we unscrew the click and the click spring. Always using a stick to hold these kind of springs down while removing them. And there you go. This was the end of the keyless works on the movement side, and now we go over to the train of wheels bridge, which still has the last movement ring screw stuck on top. And having a look at it, I think somehow it's lifting the bridge. Have a look here at the interface between the bridge and the movement plate. Yep, now it went all the way down. Not a good sign, and it can very well be that a single screw lifting the plate was the reason why the watch was running only for a few seconds. And now that I think about it, it can also be the reason why the second wheel was rubbing against the ratchet wheel. Now with the bridge out, we can see the second and third wheel and also the tiny cover plate holding the center wheel. That's the second wheel with the long pivot for the second hand and the third wheel. Before removing the cover plate, let's unscrew the barrel bridge so we free the wheel underneath. Another sign that the movement needs service urgently is parts stuck together. When the oil used for lubricating these parts gets old, it dries up and it becomes a sticky gunk that does exactly the opposite. It's even a bit abrasive, and that's one of the main reasons you should service your watches every now and then. We take off the pallet fork bridge, and there it is, the pallet fork underneath with the two rectangular pallets. The center wheel that you see here in the middle is attached to the cannon pinion on the other side of the movement, so let's turn this and start with the calendar mechanism. The cannon pinion goes out first, and it got stuck inside the tool. Okay. And then we have this big plate that holds in place the calendar wheel and all the parts underneath. It doesn't want to move. Oh, of course, I missed the screw. I thought these plates had usually 3 screws, but oh well. There you go. Now there is a lot going on here. Let's take out the... oh, wait, the spring. And that's why I should use something to hold it down and not just poke it. Thankfully, this one didn't jump far away, but trust me, I've been searching on my knees for these guys plenty of times. You can see different wheels from different mechanisms here. Those are part of the calendar setting. This one is part of the motion works to set the time, and actually, I think one of the 4 screws we removed from the cover plates was this one missing. And over here we got the keyless... Wait, what? Did the setting lever spring just snapped in half? Let me go back for a second. Oh, look at that. Do you see this little crack in here? Yep, that's where it broke. The thin section of the spring was cracked, and probably that's why the stem came detached and why we could remove it without pushing the setting lever. Another left threaded screw. And we finished the calendar mechanism with this 2-part wheel, you could say, which has a pointy section coming out that forces the calendar wheel to spin. So 3 left threaded screws for now. Usually these have some sort of indication in the screw head to kind of tell the person working on it, hey, pay attention to this one, but not in this case, or at least nothing that I recognized. This spring here is a yoke spring. This is the strongest spring in the movement. We pull it a bit to remove the yoke and the setting lever, which seems fixed in place. So let's go step by step. I know the spring looks tiny, but it will jump into oblivion if I'm not careful. So let's stitch the tweezers, take a bit of Rodico and press it until it gets stuck. Perfect. There is a screw here that I don't know what's holding in place. What is this? It looks like a very small wrench, and I think it's meant to hold down the setting lever, I guess. And there you have it, that's the bare movement plate, and this is what I was referring to. You see the sticky brownish thing on top of the ruby? This is what dried up oil looks like, and it will slowly wear the watch down. Even the cleaning machine struggles to get it out, so it's better to use some pegwood first. Now, speaking about sticky stuff, we still have the barrel stuck to the barrel bridge, so let's get this removed. Now you can see there's a black stain on the bottom of the bridge. Let's open the barrel lid and see what we're working with. So carefully pressing down from the sides gets the lid free. And then we push the arbor down and we can just lift it. It looks quite dirty, but dirt is not an issue. We can clean that easily. But these springs go weaker with time, and when that happens, the tension that they can produce is lower, and that can affect the timekeeping of the watch, and it shows as a lower amplitude in the time grapher. The arbor looks fine. That's quite a thick piece of metal, so it usually holds up well. We alternate the fingers here slowly to remove the mainspring from the barrel, and let's have a look. The spring does look a bit tired, to be fair, and especially the inner coil here should be resting on the mat, and you see it's a bit lifted. That means it's a bit bent, so we will replace it for a new one. Okay, finally time to have a look at the case and the case back. So let's start here. I see some corrosion in the border where this sits against the case, so there was probably some moisture coming in at some point. I'm using again a wooden stick. As you can see, a very useful tool. This is just a precaution to make sure it comes out perfect after we put it in the ultrasonic cleaner. Corrosion is always a tough one to remove, and it's important to get rid of all of it. This one here is mostly superficial, but if the rust goes deep into the metal, there are special chemicals that you can use to soak the parts in. You can leave them overnight and it works quite well. Last item on the list, and one I'm not looking forward to, it's the case. We have a couple of issues here, and the main one being that bent lock that needs to be straightened. But let's start with the easy part and take out the crystal. Unfortunately, we will have to replace this one. We have the same situation as with the case back here, which is a bit of rust on the surface. Again, mostly superficial, so it takes a bit of time, but it comes off quite easily. This will go directly into the ultrasonic bath, so with some luck the remaining rust will come off as well. Okay, now let's see what we do with this. We have a very bent log, and with the tools I have here, there is not many options to choose from in order to fix it. So plan A will be to wrap the log in cloth and very slowly try to correct the position with the pliers. The cloth makes it a bit more difficult to grab properly, but it should prevent scratching the whole case. Okay, I don't want to force it too much. I think it's a bit better, but we will have to keep going. I really wonder how this happened in the first place. This is a solid chunk of metal. Well, at least it seems to be going in the right direction, so let's go again once more. Now, if you see yourself in a similar situation, check first which kind of metal is the case made of. Different metals have different properties and can crack easier. Some might need to be annealed first, like for example plated brass cases. And also, if the watch is very valuable to you, I would definitely consider bringing this to the watch brand for service. To anneal stainless steel, you need extremely high temperatures, so that's not an option for us. But hey, this looks already very good. The final proof is measuring the distance between the logs, so let's go ahead. These are the lower logs at 16.95 millimeters, and the upper ones with the one we corrected, and 16.92. Perfect. 0.03 millimeters of difference, so almost identical, and we can see the case doesn't bounce anymore. Quite a relief, if I'm honest. Bending logs is not something I did before. There's always the risk to snap it, and I'm pretty sure finding a replacement for this case would have been nearly impossible. Almost everything goes inside the cleaning baskets, including the stem, and these baskets go into the watch cleaning machine. There are also some parts that go in the ultrasonic bath, as we mentioned before. Those are the case components, and the parts with paint on them, those would be the dial and the hands, don't go in either of these machines. Otherwise the paint would come right off, so usually those are left untouched. Now we put this in distilled water to help remove any traces from the cleaning solution. And we turn on the watch cleaning machine. As you can see, a very useful tool. What this does is spinning the basket in two different solutions. This one is watch cleaning solution, and the next two have a watch rinsing solution. And with the agitation and these two solvents, the movement gets cleaned fairly quickly. And this is how the parts look like after cleaning, shiny and ready to get assembled again. Alright, let's get started. Now we will not only put everything together, but we will also lubricate the movement again. Finally, after more than 60 years, I would say it's about time, and that will protect the parts against the constant wear and tear. Just think about how much movement is happening constantly inside this thing. Some people like to have their watches in automatic winders. Those are boxes that rotate and wind your watch while it's stored away, so you don't have to adjust the time and the date when you decide to wear them. That is very convenient, to be honest, but in that case, the watches will always be ticking for long periods of time, and for some of the internal parts, that means thousands and thousands of interactions between them every day. Let's go ahead and start with the train of wheels. Those are the center and scape wheel. And there was a little cover plate on top to secure the center wheel. The first times I was doing this, I had to make pictures constantly to make sure I didn't put any wheel upside down or out of place, which I highly recommend for anyone that's getting into the hobby. But after a few times, you develop a kind of sense on what the order of these are. Before we put the fourth wheel and the bridge, we have to fit the barrel, and that means installing the new mainspring. The best part of buying a new one is that it comes already lubricated in this metal ring, so it makes it easier to fit inside the barrel just by pressing down here on the sides. If you're wondering how the mainspring turns around the arbor, have a look at the hole here in the inner coil and look at this little flap in the barrel arbor. that tiny metal part goes inside the hole of the mainspring, like this. So when the arbor turns, the mainspring coils around it and all the power is stored. One thing I noticed in this Japanese Homer movement is that the main plate is not as decorated as we would see in most of the Swiss movements of the same era. These decorations were done for the most part manually back then, if not entirely, and don't have a functional purpose, so by skipping them you would be able to reduce the manufacturing costs for the watch. Technically, the movements look fairly similar to the Swiss ones I've worked on, at least for now. In general, apart from a couple of screws turning in the other direction, everything looks and feels as usual. But aesthetically, you see some of these traditional finishing techniques in Swiss movements, like perlage, Geneva stripes and so on, that we can't find here, at least in the main plate. Although we do have some sunburst in the crown and ratchet wheel. Okay, everything seems to turn freely, you can see all the wheels spinning, so let's put some oil now. Starting by lubricating the barrel, top and bottom, and then all the jewels with a lower viscosity oil. And this was kind of the different approach between Swiss and Japanese watchmaking industries. That's when wristwatches became sort of mainstream, you could say, during the 70s, and mass producing started to make sense. So, broadly speaking, having a watch movement produced in automated lines will give you more precise results in between watches at a lower cost, which was how the Japanese were going about their manufacturing. And on the other hand, having a movement with a bit more craftsmanship involved will give you slight differences in between watches and bump up the price due to manual labor, but there will be some kind of uniqueness in each watch, if that makes sense. Although these days I don't think there's much difference at all. The ratchet wheel goes in. We block it here from the side to screw it tight, and we finish the top of the barrel bridge with the click. I didn't do myself a favor here, the click can be installed before the ratchet wheel. So now we have to take an oiler and move the end of the click spring. And carefully screw the click in place. The dial side is done for now, so we can start with the keyless works, which is the set of parts that allow winding and setting the time of the watch. So basically, we have the crown popping out of the watch and it's screwed onto the stem. The stem has all these different sections with different shapes. Each one of those shapes has a different purpose and it's connected to different parts, so we need to lubricate this well. And that fits perfectly. To avoid ending up with the stem in our hand every time we pull it to set the time, which is exactly what happened before, we have this small lever. That's the setting lever with a tiny tension spring underneath. So let's see if I'm able to put this back. There is not much space at all to fit this, but we are getting there. Okay, we did it. Now we can continue with the yoke and the yoke spring, but first we put some more of this blue grease on the sliding clutch and the setting lever. The yoke goes inside its support, and the tip sits in the middle of the sliding clutch. To finish here we have the spring. The small end pushes against the ridge of the movement plate, and the longer one goes fitted against the yoke. It's not always easy to apply the right amount of grease, but you can always use a bit of Rodico to remove the excess. Now this is when we should fit in the setting lever spring that broke, and thankfully I managed to find a replacement. So with this the keyless works will be complete. There's parts more delicate than others, and this one is a bit tricky because of having a wider metal side that ends in a very thin spring. It has to be like this because the tip of the spring is what engages with the setting lever and it changes position, so having a flexible part makes things easier. We put it in place against the setting lever and then we finish screwing it. We do a quick test to make sure it's working properly and it looks great. Now we finish with the keyless works, but we would not be able to set the time just yet. For that, the movement from the stem has to be transferred to the cannon pinion and the hour wheel, which is where the minute and hour hands are set on. And now I can turn the stem, and you can see how the cannon pinion turns as well. These two wheels are not anchored to the movement, so to keep them in place, we put back the little cover plate, and with it, we just finished the motion works. The last bit will be fitting the calendar mechanism. This is the calendar driving wheel and the intermediate wheel next to it. And these two should somehow engage with each other, but I'm not seeing how this would happen. This wheel should fit inside its support on the main plate, but it doesn't. Oh, of course, I'm putting it upside down. Now you can see them engaging, and if I remember correctly, this was one of the reverse threaded screws. The screw is darker than the rest of them, so I wonder if that's the clue I was looking for. Anyway, before we can continue here, there are some jewels to be disassembled and cleaned, and those are part of Citizen's Parashock system, which is also written on the dial. Citizen came up with this in 1956, a few years before their waterproof cases, so you can see the company was pioneering the Japanese watch industry together with Seiko, and this Parashock system was the first shock absorber technology implemented in Japanese wristwatches. Seiko was a close second though. They launched their shock absorbing jewels called Diashock later that same year. We just cleaned the dry oil with a bit of pegwood, since as you saw the watch cleaning machine was not able to get rid of it, and this is called B-dip. It's a solution specifically for cleaning balance springs and jewels with old oil in them, so we make sure that everything is dissolved before we lubricate again. Unfortunately, with this Parashock system, the jewels are not as easy to take out compared to the Swiss Inca block. What I'm using for these are two sewing needles that I sandpapered a bit to avoid scratching the plate. They do the job, but it's quite tricky. And this one is not any better. These are the jewels for the escape wheel. And here we have three small supports, and we can use those to rotate the spring until the flaps align with the hole in the setting and can be taken off. It's a bit surprising to see any kind of shock protection for the escape wheel, especially in a caliber at the lower price point, but it's a nice feature. The pivots in the escape wheels are one of the smallest ones, so it definitely helps. And guess what Citizen did to prove their technology? Not buoys this time, but in Citizen fashion, you could say, they took some Parashock watches on a helicopter and started dropping them from 30 meters high directly onto the floor. And hey, kudos to them, risky stunt, and they pulled it off. None of the watches were damaged afterwards, and I'm guessing people were convinced about the shock resistance after that. We just installed the date wheel, again with the plastic tweezers, because these numbers are painted on top, and now you see this small lever that gets pushed in between the date wheel teeth by this small spring. Let's see if I can put it in place. That's what keeps the wheel in the correct position, so you see the number perfectly centered through the window on the dial, and also makes it snap in place at midnight. Now with this cover plate, we secure all the parts underneath, and we are done on this side. The only thing left here is to put the dial, but first let's put the balance in place and see if the watch is working now. First we have to clean it, so we do the same as with the jewels. The hairspring is very delicate, and any traces of residues will affect the rotation back and forth of the balance, so just a few seconds in the B-dip solution and we should be good to go. Now we dry it gently with the blower and we can check if we brought it back from the dead or not. Okay, slowly we go in a bit sideways, and we have to make sure that the pivots are inside the jewel holes. And it runs. Okay, great. Well, good news is that it's running, but the bad news, can you see the balance wobbling? That's not good. And it shows in the time grapher. We're seeing quite a bad rate and a terrible bit error. And again, considering how wobbly the balance was, This is likely because the balance staff is broken. To check that, we have to have a look at the pivots under the microscope. For that, we remove the power from the mainspring, this time I didn't forget, and then we have to take the balance apart. Carefully. So now we have to unscrew this little guy here to free the hairspring stud, and then we turn this little pin here, which is the regulator. Let's see if I can show it on camera. This is quite delicate. If the screwdriver slips, I can easily ruin the hairspring. That should be enough. And then with an oiler, we can push it upwards. And the regulator here has a little reach to fit the screwdriver. And then turning it clockwise should free the hairspring. Perfect. Now we can just lift the balance wheel, which has the balance staff and hairspring attached. Now to replace the broken staff, I got a new balance complete for this caliber, and you can see it comes packed in between two little pillows to make sure it doesn't bounce around. You can also buy only the balance staff, but the assembly onto the hairspring and the balance wheel is quite finicky, so when it's possible, I try to avoid it. On the left, you can see the old balance complete and the new one on the right. Both pivots on the left one are shorter compared to the new one, but have a look at the upper pivots and check how different they look. These pivots get worn out with time, and that's most likely the reason why we had so much end shake. Okay, it's good to see that we found the issue, and now that we are here, you might have noticed that we have another of these Parashock jewels on top of the balance cog. So let's take it apart and clean it as well. We take out this little hook. This one holds in place the regulator and the block for the jewels, and this is the balance cog disassembled. Here we have the regulator, which is the outer ring, and the block for the jewels. Now you can see under the microscope the block for the jewels disassembled. In the center we have what they call the spiral ring, which has two jewels on top. This left one is the perforated jewel, and check out how small it is. This is the head of one of the needles I was using before, extremely small, and the right one is the cap jewel. So in theory, the spiral ring that holds the tiny jewel is supposed to dissipate lateral shocks. Let's see if I can... come on. Now, and the cap jewel with these T-joints goes on top and dissipates the vertical shocks so that the pivots don't break. Before placing it, I put a drop of oil in the middle of the cap jewel, and that looks about right. And now we can assemble the whole thing again and install the new balance wheel. These replacement parts we used are new old stock, except for the mainspring, which is usually replaced by a generic one. If you find yourself into the hobby and looking for new parts at some point, that is what the NOS acronym stands for, new old stock. This is usually specified by the sellers, and what it means is that the part is original and new, so it has not been opened yet, but it's likely been discontinued and in someone's stock for ages. It's usually better to get, if you can, original parts, but it depends a lot on the availability, and sometimes the parts can cost more than the watch itself. That's a, let's say, annoying side of fixing vintage watches. Looking for new parts can be a nightmare, so I'm glad we found the ones we needed. Unfortunately, I paid quite a lot for the balance complete. This is always one of the most expensive parts, so I'm not going to assemble it under the microscope. I'm going to use the loop just to make sure I don't mess the new hairspring up. But basically, we have to turn the regulator pin back in position and screw the hairspring stud in place. And we are now ready to give it a second shot. It carefully goes in. Okay, good, it still works. And the amplitude looks quite good as well. That's the degrees that the balance is turning back and forth. There's still a bit of play, but that's expected. Let's see what the time grapher says. Nice rate, plus 6 seconds, plus 4 seconds. Nice amplitude at 252 degrees, and acceptable bit error at 0.7 milliseconds, especially considering that we don't have a bit error corrector in this balance because of how old the movement is. I prefer not to touch the balance anymore. Good, very happy with how this works now. After the cleaning, a few parts replaced and everything oiled, we have successfully recovered the movement. Now the cherry on top is this absolutely stunning dial. I kept coming back to the bench when I was waiting for the new parts to arrive just to have another look at it. It's really one of a kind and luckily in good conditions. The rule of thumb with dials is that you should try to touch them as little as possible. So basically 99% of the times it's only removing the dust and any residue on top, but that's it. The manufacturing process of these dials involves several layers of paint with different finishes and also a lacquer layer on top, so trying to clean them with solvents and sometimes even with water can dissolve these layers and ruin the dial completely. To finish the dial side, the hour wheel goes in, which is where the hour hand goes mounted on, and before we put the dial, let's check if the calendar works, and it does. We fix the dial in place with two tiny screws on the side, and these screws press against two pins coming directly out of the dial itself, called the dial feet. Now it's time to put the hands on, and for this we again turn the dial until it clicks to a new day, which means that the time is exactly 12 o'clock. The first one going in is the hour hand aligned with the triangular marker. Bit more. It's quite tricky with the tool I'm using since I have to center it by eye with the center of the hand. I think I should find a better solution for this. And now the second hand ticks right away. Perfect! Quick check to make sure the hands don't bump into each other and it looks all good. The last part to be replaced is the crystal. This one is, beyond repair, and for that we have to measure it first. So we have 31.03 millimeters in diameter, and I have these two crystals here that are close enough. We will go with 31. These are not new old stock, these are generic crystals made out of plexiglass, like the original one, but you can also get them in different materials and shapes depending on what you're working with. Some luxury brands have their own crystals as well, for example Omega. Their watches, you will see a tiny logo right in the middle of the crystal, which is pretty cool. It's easier to know if you have the original or not by just checking that, but also getting an Omega branded crystal is much more expensive and often difficult to find. These acrylic crystals are a bit flexible, so the way to install them is to bend them with the press to reduce their diameter. I use a bit of plastic in between to avoid scratches. This is the same I put when I'm going to remove the hands. We slid the case upwards and then let the glass expand inside the case. And that's it. You can see like night and day compared to the one which is removed. Now, to assemble the case, we have to fit the movement back inside the movement ring first. The ring keeps the dial centered, and again, judging by how thick this one is, it seems to be part of the case design to achieve the waterproof level. However, in this specific Citizen Parawater case, there's something missing, actually something quite important, and this is the rubber gasket in between the movement and the ring. I was reading a bit about all these waterproof mechanisms, and Citizen also made their own O-rings from a special rubber, but unfortunately I could not find an original one. In this case, it doesn't matter much since I can already tell you this watch is not going underwater anymore. And we're finally here. The last thing to do is to screw the case back, to press the case in. This is a snap-in case back. A bit unusual for water-resistant watches. You usually see screw-back cases, but to be fair, it seems quite tight. And there you go. One of the most beautiful dials I've got the chance to work with, and a really, really cool watch. As you know though, we are not done until we put some new straps on it. After all this work, we have to leave this ready to wear. So I got these black leather ones that have the stitching matching the patina on the loom, and look at this beauty. Such a fun project. A nice little watch from, I would say, the most influential watchmaking country outside of Switzerland. A lot of tradition and cool stories behind the Citizen brand. And as a side note, I'm pretty sure not all the buoys with Parawater watches in them were recovered, so who knows? I will keep an eye open during my next beach day. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you learned something new and enjoyed the restoration. And by the way, if you want updates in between projects, follow me on Instagram. Thanks again, and see you on the next one.